Craig Dorsey told me that he and his father had always been friends. Craig was an only child and grew up in Hanover, Pennsylvania, in the very same house where he was born. His father was the high school history teacher, his mother taught social studies, and as long as Craig can remember, his father would zing him with a quote from history. He'd say something like, "Okay, Craig, who said this and where did he say it?" Quote, "My country is the world. My religion is to do good." End quote. He wouldn't tell Craig the answers. He'd leave it up to Craig to do the research and make the discoveries on his own. Now, Craig knew his father was trying to turn him into a history nut, but Craig's dream was someday to be CEO of a major corporation. Craig's mother died of cancer when he was a junior in high school, and he and his father became even closer. Craig won a fellowship to the University of Pennsylvania at Harrisburg, and the summer before he left for college, he and his dad spent 3 whole months rebuilding an ancient Volvo, restoring it to its original pristine nature. 3 years later, Craig was in a management class just about to take a pop quiz the day before Thanksgiving break when the head of the department stuck his head into the room and gestured Craig into the hall. "Craig," he said, "we've just had a call from the park. When your father didn't show up for work this morning, one of his friends went over to check on him. Your dad died in his sleep last night. Now, you go on. You can catch up on everything later. If there's anything we can do to help, let us know." Immediately, one of his dad's quotations popped into his mind. Craig knew who'd said it. Patrick Henry, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. It was, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." The first thing Craig remembered after that was standing in front of his closet, sifting through his clothes, trying to find something, a suit he could possibly wear to a funeral. He threw everything he thought he'd need into a suitcase and began the drive down Highway 15 to Gettysburg. He hadn't even reached the first rest stop when he realized he couldn't see the highway through his tears. He pulled to the side of the road. He was remembering the last conversation he'd had with his father a week ago. Now, over the past 6 months, whenever they'd talk, his father's voice had an excited lilt to it, and Craig had asked, "Dad, what's going on? Let me guess. You've met someone. You're in love, right?" His father had laughed. "Oh, speak for yourself, son. How's Amanda?" And so, of course, Craig had to bring his dad up to date with all his news about Amanda, the love of his life. And when he'd heard all he was going to hear, his father said, "Well, son, I have actually met someone. Well, in a way met someone, but it isn't anything romantic. I've stumbled into some kind of a mystery, and, well, this might be something we'll have to figure out together." And when Craig had pressed him for details, he said, "Maybe over Thanksgiving break, we can work on this puzzle I'm fiddling with. I'd really like your help on it." Craig sat there in his car. Why hadn't he gone home last weekend? There wasn't a single reason he couldn't have. He'd spent all his free time with Amanda. And there wasn't any reason he couldn't have taken her to Gettysburg with him. He got back on the highway and pulled off again just north of York Springs, but by the time he reached Gettysburg, he was pretty well cried out. He headed straight towards his dad's small 2-room apartment on the 2nd floor of the Dobbin House Tavern. The owner stopped him just as he was about to climb the stairs. Craig, take all the time you need. 2 weeks, 2 months. I'm in no hurry to rent that apartment. Your dad was a good friend. I never met anyone as hot for history. Did you know that this tavern did duty as a hospital during the Civil War? And the floorboards in this room are Pennsylvania long pine. Those trees were extinct in Pennsylvania. Oh, son, I'm sorry. You go on. We can talk about all this another time. When Craig opened the door of his father's apartment, the afternoon sun had just broken through the west windows and shot a shaft of light across the bed, spotlighting a pile of books on the bedside table. Each of the books had blue paper bookmarks sticking out of their pages, and the paper looked hand-torn. Craig sat down on his father's bed and picked up the top one. It was A Brief History of Company E, 18th Georgia Infantry, Confederate States of America. He opened the book to the marker and noticed a lightly penciled question mark in front of the name Joseph Ballard, Gordon County, Georgia. Prisoner of war, July 3rd, 1863, Gettysburg. He flipped through the book, but there were no other marks or references to Joseph Ballard. The second book was a Volvo repair manual, and the marker opened to a page on mufflers with no penciled notations. But written on the blue paper itself was this message, in his father's handwriting: Craig, Joe McIntosh, Waynesboro, and there was a phone number. The third book was Civil War regalia. Now, the first half was Union Army, the last half Confederate. The marker opened the book to 2 pages of photographs of belt buckles, all with that definitive CSA. There were no pencil marks. Written on the bookmark was this question: Am I seeing what I'm seeing because I want to see it or because I need to see it? Damn it, Dad! Why couldn't you have waited for me? This mystery is too deep. I'm never going to be able to solve it by myself. Craig went over to the national park and met his father's co-workers. After his mother's death, Craig's dad had retired early from teaching to take up his lifelong dream, interpreter at Gettysburg National Park. He'd needled his son, too, when Craig declared himself a business major. Oh, business. I didn't realize that was a course of study. I thought it was just something you did. Here's a quote for you, Craig. See if you can figure out who said this. If A is success in life, then A equals X plus Y plus Z, and X equals work, Y is play, and Z is keep your mouth shut. Okay. Who said it, Craig? Well, Craig found out it was Albert Einstein. He'd done his research because he thought the quote might be useful to him in his journey to CEO. Craig had helped his dad pack up the family home and move into this 2-room apartment in the Dobbin House Tavern. And he'd also helped build the bookshelves for the hundreds of volumes his dad had been collecting. His dad's best friend at the park, the one who'd found him in his apartment, put his arms around Craig's shoulders and said, You know, Craig, I found your dad lying on his right side, his right hand on his left shoulder, knees bent, left arm along his thigh. He died in his sleep, son. He was never in any pain. Craig recognized that posture. It was how his dad slept, and so did he. He also realized how much everyone at the park admired and loved his dad. He spent the rest of the day calling his family and friends, making arrangements for the funeral on Saturday. And because it was Thanksgiving vacation, quite a few people weren't able to come. On Thursday morning, he called Joe McIntosh in Waynesboro. The call rang twice and was then forwarded to Joe's home. Joe turned out to be an auto mechanic specializing in foreign cars. He invited Craig over for dinner, but Craig declined. And then Joe said, Your dad told me about that Volvo. It's going to need quite a bit of work to get it ready for fine-tuning. Why not bring it over tomorrow, Friday, and we'll get all the wrinkles out of it?" Craig protested. But I didn't have an appointment. You didn't know that I—" Joe interrupted. "There's nothing in the world I'd like better to do than spend a day with you, lad. I feel as though I know you from all the tales your father's told me." And so Craig spent all of Friday under the hood or beneath his Volvo with Joe. And during the afternoon, Craig asked, "You know, my father was puzzling over some kind of a mystery he was trying to solve. Did he happen to mention it to you?" "Aye, he did," said Joe. "He talked about it quite often, and he was intent to locate information on this young Georgia infantryman. I think his name was Ballard or something." "Joseph Ballard?" "Aye, Joseph Ballard. He didn't tell me why he was searching for him, of course, but he was hot on the trail of something, and that's for sure." Craig crawled into his father's bed that night, exhausted, with a backache. But he also felt a strange undercurrent of anticipation. Somehow he felt as though he was closer to knowing what his father had been talking about. He fell asleep and awoke in moonlight. The moon was full, and its light mimicked the sun 2 days before, slanting across the bed in a bright spotlight with sharp edges. Craig lay there, watching the dust motes dance in the moonlight, but suddenly he felt the hairs on the back of his neck and on his arms stand up. He had a very strong feeling that there was someone in the room with him. He couldn't see beyond the light, so he turned his head to the right and stared at the books on the shelves, still in darkness. He stared until he could begin to make out some of the titles, and then turned his head back into the light, looking beyond it. And then he saw him. A young man standing right next to the bed, just beyond the moonlight. He couldn't have been more than 17 or 18. He was so close to the bed that Craig could see moisture in his gray-blue eyes, could see a 2 or 3 days' stubble of whiskers, and could smell the stench of old sweat. He was wearing an undershirt filthy with blood and dirt, and his trousers, well, which might once have been light blue, were also so covered with dirt and blood, Craig was unable to make out their color. They were held up by a belt with its familiar buckle, CSA. Craig was about to sit up when he noticed the man was holding something pressed to his right thigh. A knife, he thought. But immediately the soldier raised his right hand and, pressing both hands together, gathered his strength to shove a bayonet into and through Craig's chest. The blade went entirely through him, but Craig didn't feel it. What he felt was the force of the young man's hatred. It happened so fast, but Craig sat up and yelled as the soldier turned away, looking back over his shoulder with an ironic smile of satisfaction. The soldier took 1 step toward the door and disappeared. Craig leapt out of bed. He searched the apartment, but of course there was no one there. The door was locked from the inside. He grabbed the book of Civil War regalia and flipped through the pages till he found the bayonets. He scanned them all until he found what he thought he had seen in the soldier's hands, a socket bayonet from an Enfield rifle. When his heart stopped pounding, he lay down in his father's bed, exhilarated. Now he knew what the mystery was. His father had seen this same ghost. His father thought he knew who the ghost was. He wondered how many times had his father seen the ghost. Often, he suspected, because of the quote, "Am I seeing what I'm seeing because I want to see it or because I need to see it?" But was the ghost really Joseph Ballard? And if so, how did his father know? And perhaps, even more important, who had been lying in that bed when Joseph Ballard had lowered his bayonet. Early Saturday morning he went back to the park and spent the rest of the morning sorting his father's papers, separating his private research from his work. And as he looked, he was frustrated because he couldn't find anything about Joseph Ballard. He spent the rest of the day on Saturday with his family and friends at the funeral and most of Sunday, and he didn't tell anything about the ghost and the puzzle because he realized that they all had their own stories and he needed to hear them. Sunday night, after everyone had left, he found himself sorting through his father's books, looking for more slips of paper, and then he found it. A full sheet, 8.5 by 11, blue, folded into a book about, Albert Einstein. On the paper, his father had written, Mary Chestnut, responding to a letter from her friend Augusta Ballard, Gordon County, Georgia, 1864, says, "Oh, my darling Augusta, how may I ease your grief? The loss of sweet Joseph. We shall never know what horror precipitated his action, but be assured, for your lovely son, to have raised a weapon against a friend that night in hospital, a much worse crime was then revenged. Would that I could hold you in my arms." Over the next 2 weeks, Craig selected all the books on the Civil War and stored them away in boxes in the trunk of his car. Amanda came down from Harrisburg and helped him pack the other personal effects, and together they shipped them off to family and friends. 3 days after Craig got back to Penn, he found himself standing in front of the secretary in the Department of History. "Could you tell me, please, just exactly what do I have to do to change my major?" "To history, I presume," she said, and handed him a form. "Fill that out and talk to one of the advisors." Craig sat down at the desk and filled in the form, and as he handed it back to her, the door opened and a young professor entered the office. The secretary gleefully said, "Well, you're in luck. Here's the best of the lot. Dr. Gillespie, this will interest you." And with that, she passed Craig's form to the professor. He took it, scanned it. He smiled. "Dorsey. Dorsey? You wouldn't by any chance be related to George Dorsey? Hanover High School? Best teacher I ever had." "Me too," said Craig. "He was my dad." It took Craig another full year to complete his requirements for a B.A. in history, but he graduated with honors. He went on to an M.A. and a Ph.D., and he's now a professor of history at a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania. We've talked occasionally through the years, and I always ask him the same questions. "Craig, was it really Joseph Ballard? Do you know the name of the person lying in the bed?" And he always laughs. "No, Nancy, I've never found anything more than Mary Chestnut's letter, and there's no report that I can find of what happened in the hospital that night." "Have you ever seen him again, the ghost?" "No," he says, "I haven't. I think he belongs to the Dobbin House Tavern. I'd have to be there to see him again. But Nancy, I suspect that if I do see him, the next morning Mandy will find me lying on my right side, my right hand across my left shoulder, knees bent, my left hand along my thigh, and, well, she'll tell all my friends that I died peacefully in my sleep."